retired Grant County archaeologist, and I'll let him talk about what he's going to do, and then at the end of this, we're going to tell you we have several upcoming events coming on. There's go.
All right, thanks, Jim. Thank you folks for showing up, and thanks for the invite down here. This is going to be a fairly casual talk. People hearing me okay in the back? I can't really tell. Okay. I'm not used to mics, but I'll try to behave with it and keep it on. I'm going to have to sit down so I can read my own slides and tell you what I'm showing you. So I'm going to do that. And what I'd like to do is, if you guys have questions as we're going along, feel free to go ahead and just ask them. Let's kind of keep it informal that way, if that works for you guys. And if you need to, shout at me, if I'm missing a question in the back or something. Let me see, what else do I want to say about this? Probably not a lot until we just dig into it. Yeah, I think I have the introduction in here. So, let's see. So this slide is showing a sketch of Peter Skeen Ogden from one of his notebooks, probably when he was in his 30s, and heading these snake country expeditions, they're called. And I'll explain what that means in a few minutes here. And of course, the beaver, because this was all about gathering beaver pelts. And so the fur trappers, these groups of fur trappers, these were Hudson Bay, Canadian, based out of Britain, fur trappers coming down here. And these were the first non-Native American folks to travel through this part of the country and actually leave a written record. Probably the first folks to travel through here at all. It's certainly the only ones where we have any written documentation of what they saw. So, why were there fur trappers out here in the early 1800s, 1820s, trapping beaver fur? Because beaver fur, the fine fur in beaver fur, there's a coarse fur on the outside they would remove, and then the fine inner hairs that kept the beavers warm in the winter and swimming and all that made the finest felt that made these fancy hats that the elite people in Europe were dying for and spending incredible amounts of money for. And this was a fashion style that went on for a few centuries. So there used to be beaver in Europe, all over Russia, and they were all trapped out and decimated there. And so these different companies, realizing that there was a lot of value in this, and I can't even begin to imagine what that value is, started sending trappers, into Canada and eastern United States originally, or before it was the United States, up in Hudson Bay, and started trapping out those areas. And for over a century, traveling through North America, doing this gathering for these lovely hats you see in the picture there, including like the trifold or triangular Revolutionary War hat that we see. Abe Lincoln's big stovepipe hat was kind of one of those, but I think by Abe Lincoln's time they had already changed from beaver felt to silk. But anyway, when I learned that this was all about these hats, I was just kind of appalled. What a crazy thing to drive all this history. So, the Nez Perce district, as it was called by the Hudson Bay, was this large area of the interior Northwest, the dots on that map, which are part of Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. And this is the country that Peter Skeen Ogden did his work from. So Fort Nez Perce on the Columbia River up where Walla Walla is now was the headquarters for this district and where all these fur trapping expeditions came out from. And you may remember this from early Oregon history, but there was several decades in the early 19th century, starting in 1818, the US and the British formed an agreement to share ownership, if you will. They didn't actually ask the Indian people about this, but share ownership of the greater Pacific Northwest, what's now Idaho, Washington, Oregon, and parts of British Columbia. They couldn't figure out where to put the dividing line between what's now Canada and the United States. So in 1918, they did this joint occupation agreement, and in 10 years they were going to meet and settle where the boundary was. But in 10 years they weren't ready, and they put it on and on. I think it was sometime in the 1840s they finally settled on where the border with Canada now is. There was a big debate. Canada really wanted it to be the Columbia River, which would have, been interesting for Washington. Because of this political situation, besides the driver to get wealth by getting these furs so that fancy people in Europe could have neat hats, the other big driver here was political for the British. They were trying, the idea was during this period of joint ownership, the more citizens of which country would end up being in the land out here would tend to sway it so that it would be, if it was mostly Americans or people who were Americans at that point, then it would probably go to the US, and if it was mostly Canadians, then it would go to Canada. So the Hudson Bay Fur Trapping Company, this large corporation based in London, working with the British government, decided to try to decimate the beaver populations in the interior Northwest here. So the American fur trapping companies that were coming over from St. Louis overland over the Rockies would find out there's no beaver, and the hope was they'd just throw up their hands and go home. Well, that didn't quite work out for them, but they knew they were over-trapping the beaver. They were intentionally trying to wipe them out so that the Americans wouldn't see a benefit of coming to the Northwest. So, and I always kind of wondered about that, but there is actually in Hudson Bay Company governor, the head of the company, George Simpson, the head of the Pacific Northwest part of the Hudson Bay Company. He explained in his diary, we have convincing proof that the country down here, in this the so-called snake country, was a rich reserve of beaver, and for political reasons, we should endeavor to destroy as fast as possible the beaver out here. So this was an interesting political twist of what they were doing. So they chose one Peter Skeen Ogden to run this. And this is a picture of Peter Ogden when he was retired and living in Oregon City several years after the Snake Country expeditions. And he was an interesting character. He was a son of a prominent family from originally northeastern, what's now the United States, but during the Revolutionary War, they sided with Britain and moved up into Canada because they weren't so popular anymore in the United States. And I think he was even sent to law school. His father was a judge, but he thought law was really boring and wanted to do something more adventurous, and became a fur trapper and got involved with originally the Northwest Country. So there were two big fur companies, British-owned fur companies in Canada, competing with each other, and he was in the competitors group to the Hudson Bay Company. And they were literally getting an open warfare with each other and attacking each other. And the British government finally stepped in and said, cut it out, you're now one company, because they gave the license that allowed them to do this. And it was named the Hudson Bay Company. I guess they were first by a few months. And they had to merge the two groups together. Ogden, as a young man, was such a capable fighter for the Northwest Company against Hudson Bay. Hudson Bay didn't want him and fought it. He went all the way from the Pacific Northwest here to London to plead his case to Hudson Bay Company headquarters, and they, okay, we'll give you a chance. Came all the way back here and was put in charge of these groups. So he was a, shall we say, a scrappy gentleman. So the brigades, what were these groups? They called them the Snake Country Expeditions. So the Snake Country, of course, is the Snake River drainage, which in all his notes gets referred to as the South Fork of the Columbia. And it was named after the Indian people that lived out here. So now the Northern Paiutes, the Bannock, and the Shoshone basically were considered the Snake Indian folks. And this was called Snake Country. So the brigades, the groups of people that came out, the expeditions, oh yeah, some of this I'm going to be reading this, so you don't necessarily have to read it. hate when they give presentations, they just read off of it. But there's some reasons I need to do it this time. So, look at something else if you want. The expedition stayed in the field over 10 months every year, including the winter when beaver fur was at its finest. So they were actually traveling in the worst possible times of year out here.
Linda?
You got a meal coming? No problem.
Where's Linda?
Linda, you got a meal. Okay. The beaver was at its finest. These were significantly large parties of several dozen trappers, guides, hunters, often their families. I mean, there were usually 30 or 40 wives, generally over 100 to 150 people in all. They brought with them over 200 horses to carry supplies in the field and haul back the beaver pelts. They were a very culturally diverse group of people, included in their ranks French Canadians, Iroquois Indians from northeast United States and Canada, Scots, Brits, Plains Indians from the central states, Hawaiians, and I think you probably all know that the Owyhee River is named after a group of Hawaiian fur trappers that disappeared on one of these expeditions. Métis, who are the French word for folks that had an American Indian and a French parent. And Northwest Indians, different Indians from the area here who joined this group. So they were hiring a really diverse group of folks. Many of the trappers were company men, so they were indentured servants. They signed an agreement with the Hudson Bay Company and got supplies and got food and stuff on these expeditions, but they had to earn so much that went directly to the company before they became freemen. And so that was when, so there was a core group that were those folks. Then there were freemen. These are folks who already got their freedom, but decided they liked the line of work, or other folks that came in. Sometimes American trappers would jump ship and start working for these guys, and vice versa. So the independent trappers, I don't want to use the term motley, but it was a complex group of people that were traveling. The Hudson Bay Company formally frowned on families of their trappers joining the expeditions. So in the records that we're keeping, they're hardly mentioned until something bad happens. A child or a woman disappears for a while. Luckily, in all the cases I've read so far, they've always found them. And it wasn't a disaster, but it made Ogden nervous enough that he slipped up and left or mentioned it in the notes. Because these all went back to London. And when the headquarters in London saw something they didn't like, they sent letters back saying, hey, you shouldn't have done this, you shouldn't have done that. So he tried to keep that on the down low. One of the big mysteries about Ogden is he did have an American Indian wife. But we don't know if she was on these trips with her, because he never mentions it. It could be, and if she was there, his kids were there too. There were usually like 30 children in these things. Again, over the winter at this time of year, I find it just amazing. When I first was looking into this, I said, 20 trappers maybe going out on these little parties, all men. I had no idea it was this large group. Okay. The logistics. So they had to supply this group moving through, there were no stores to stock. There was nothing, they didn't quite know where they were going into. They did hire American Indians who knew part of the country, or at least knew the languages. So a lot of the Columbia River Indians already had working relationships, either worked for Hudson Bay. So I'm speaking of the Warm Springs, the Umatilla, the Cayuse, Nez Perce, those folks. And a lot of them spoke some of the Paiute and Bannock language because they had trading relationships down here. So they'd be hired, and they had, if they didn't have direct knowledge, some idea of what the country was, so they could serve as guides. So again, they had guides and professional hunters. So, groups of people and horses was there. Basic staples and trading goods were brought along, but most food had to be procured through trade and hunting won the field. Trails, such as they were often rocky and steep, and several horses perished en route. Several, I should have said a different word in there. Probably a third to maybe up to half the horses died. Sometimes just because of how rough it was, sometimes because they were a food supply for these guys. They were somewhat regularly having to kill their horses because game was scarce, which I'll talk about in a little bit. More frequently, hunters were lost when they were killed to provide food when hunting was unproductive. Local American Indian groups responded to the incursions in their territory in a variety of ways, from friendly invitations to trade to violent attacks. Horses were particularly valuable, esteemed commodity, and had to be constantly watched. The beaver pelts had to be properly cleaned, dried, and stored, or their value would be lost. So it was tricky. The supplies that they needed, gunpowder, shot, the traps, 200 traps they were bringing with, and these were heavy. Extra steel to repair the traps. The chains, because they had to be well anchored, a beaver would get stuck in the trap and then swim in the deeper water, and they'd lose the beaver. All the food, rum and brandy, all these things, and there are a list in these notes of everything. Once a year, a ship came around the Horn from England up to Fort Vancouver, where Vancouver, Washington is now, and dropped off all the supplies that then got taken overland to Fort Nez Perce, that then got dispersed to these guys. And because it was a big corporation they were working for, they had to track it all. So for historians, it's a pretty neat set of records. So the journals. American trappers were coming through at about the same time, not nearly as well organized. They were smaller groups. They were more like the model I was thinking of 10 to 20 guys working together maybe, and sometimes individuals. So the picture of the mountain man we have. And then they'd meet in rendezvous and get their furs back to St. Louis and sell them. But they had no obligation to write journals, so most of them did not. There's not the kind of written record. But because this was a big corporation, they wanted to know what their money, the shareholders back in London wanted to know what their money was being spent on, and so they wanted details, the cost of the profits, how many pelts they were getting, daily tally of the number of beaver brought into camp, any losses the group sustained to equipment, supplies, and horses, comments concerning the direction and condition of the route, because these are the first people passing through, and they thought they might have other groups, so they wanted those records for the next route. Relations with local Indians, which they needed to obtain food in trade, and they needed to know what was coming up, and then they were teaching some of them how to hunt beavers so they could actually collect beaver for them and bring them out. And then the quality and quantity of the observations recorded varied between the individual leaders. Ogden happened to be pretty articulate and curious and wrote a lot of nice, fleshing out comments that are interesting, and I'm going to go through some of those in a little bit when I'm done with this overview. Okay. So here's a map of Ogden's 1826-1827 expedition that covers, I'm kind of using Harney County more or less as a model, because that's where you all are from. And, but the information continues in other areas. We're going to concentrate on this piece of ground. I've also done this for Grant County to our north. That's a different problem. So you can kind of see they came down Immigrant Creek, jumped over from Crooked River, came down Immigrant Creek, Sylvia's River, Harney Lake. Then they dropped down to the Klamath Lakes area and went way out in there, and then eventually routed their way back. They went up to Crooked River, and then down to Klamath, and then came back up and through, and then crossed over kind of where Druzy is onto the Malheur River, Gentura. So that's all kind of the local country here that he traveled in 26, 27. So I'm not going to go through each log note, but I'm going to give you some of the more interesting ones. And this is, I just go ahead and write exactly what he wrote, with the punctuation errors and the funny spelling from back then. And then when I find it interesting enough, I'll maybe give a little explanation. So again, a good time if anyone's got questions to go through. If I've lost you on something, feel free to jump in. You probably need to shout because it's a little dark and I'm staring at this, so I won't see it. Sunday, the 7th of October, he was off by day. An early hour this morning, Mr. McKay, with 25 trappers and each 2 horses well loaded with traps, started for the Sylvia's River, discovered last year by Anton Sauvé, who was a former indentured trapper, but he got his freedom and a member of his previous expedition. It is supposed we will reach the Sylvia's River and camp in 3 days. I wish them every success. So he sent this group of trappers ahead, and the main camp is slowly moving behind them. I started at 8 o'clock, he started. So the trappers left earlier. He started at 8 a.m. We reached the height of the land, and here a most gloomy prospect presented itself to my view.
As far as the eye could reach, one continuous range of mountains already covered in snow. The ascent was very gradual, but the descent the reverse. We reached a small stream which appears to run southeast, and this we followed a considerable distance and encamped. Course this day 4 miles, east 4 miles, south 10 miles, and they caught 6 beaver. 1 antelope was killed. Late in the evening, 2 of the trappers who had been absent the last 2 days came in with 2 beavers, so the total of the 8. That's not a glorious count for them. Now we jump to the 11th of October. So this is all in the fall. We started at 6 a.m., having taken our precautions to tie our horses last night. At 12, we reached the river, which is Emigrant Creek, and found Mr. McKay with a part of the trappers. The remainder of him proceeded down the river in the hopes of finding beaver. Here it appears, the Indians, the Paiute Indians, have been working, have a few beaver remaining and too wild to be taken. Our road was as hilly as yesterday, but not as stony. We saw a road of last winter, and I have an opinion of crossing the mountains here, and last winter there was no great difference at this point of distance, but for the horses it was preferable. So the rocky nature of the ground out here, most of these horses did not have horseshoes, wore down their hooves, and were a major issue both for the horses and for the trappers and the party. So he would sometimes go longer distances on less rocky ground. So it's hilly but not as stony. Opinion crossing the mountain here, of course, 15 miles. The Emigrant Creek appears to take south in the course. It should be Sandwich Island River. Sandwich Island was the early name for Hawaii, so he's talking about what we now call the Owyhee River. He thought at first maybe Immigrant Creek was a branch of that, and discovered it wasn't later. 18 beavers from the traps, so a little better than before, and a slight rain in the afternoon. So, 15th of October, rain did not cease till near midnight. At an early hour this morning, I dispatched 2 men to bring me information relative to the affair of yesterday, which I'll get into in detail. Having drive our lodges at 9, so they got up at daybreak and dried out their tents. By 9 o'clock, they were dry enough, they figured they could follow the banks of the Red Creek. At a hilly and stony road to 1 p.m., we reached 12 of our trappers encamped. It was from this encampment that 7 horses were stolen yesterday by some Paiute folks. But beyond this, where the men were wounded. Shortly after my arrival, Mr. McKay made his appearance and related me the following particulars. So this is, to my knowledge, the first engagement between the local American Indians and non-local folks. Turns out one or both of these folks were actually other American Indians, but from eastern Canada. And here's how Ogden explains the altercation. The night before last, 3 Paiute Indians stole 7 horses from this camp and crossed over a point of land, and to their surprise were met by Payette and Baptiste, Iroquois indentured trapper who became a free man in 1827. The Iroquois who were at this time in the act of visiting their traps. So here he refers to both of them as Iroquois. So I'm not sure if Payette, I thought he was a French Canadian, but maybe Iroquois took a French name. So they were out checking their traps and saw the Indians with horses, immediately suspected they were stolen and pursued and overtook them. The Indians, the Paiutes who took the horses offered no resistance, delivered up the horses. This, however, did not satisfy the 2 men who demanded payment from the Indians. To this, they also readily consented by offering some roots and for provisions, also some other arrows. But this did not satisfy Baptiste, who observed this was not the first time they have stolen horses from us, and they never have been punished. Let us beat and chastise them as well, but not kill. On saying this, he lost no time with his whip handle. The Indians, the Paiutes, for some time endured the blows, but at length becoming vexed, one seized, I believe, should be Baptiste, and the others Payette. Now a long scuffle ensued. One of the Indians was killed, the Paiutes. Both men were severely wounded and saved themselves by flight, abandoning their weapons and horses. So in this, I'm reading, Ogden was not real impressed with the nature of his men on this, that they kind of turned around and picked the fight with these guys and then ended up losing it. He goes on to discuss it a little. The two remaining Indians, the ones that didn't die, of the Paiutes, finding they had gained so decided advantage, began to fire their arms on the 7 stolen horses, killed 4 of them. And at this time, seeing a man coming towards them on horseback, so one of the other trappers heard the commotion or something, was coming over to help, take off with Payette and Baptiste's horses, rifles, and guns with their blankets. And with this, the 4 horses they killed is our point of view, the loss we sustained. But again, when Ogden, view it from a different light, I have to remark, we have sustained a most shameful defeat, in which, although it will not be lost on them, it is true, one Indian was killed. This, according to the Indian mode, is so much in our favor. In other words, they should be scared of us because we killed one of them. But they have gone off fully impressed with the idea that both our men are dead, and they will have no difficulty in convincing the other Paiute of this when they have the most convincing truth, which is their horses and guns. And so the way I can put it was, it is most disgraceful to us. So he thought it was a loss because it would also encourage perhaps other Paiute to also try to raid and take the horses. Beaver taken in this camp from 8 men in 4 days amounts to 65 beavers. So now they're talking. That's the kind of level they're getting. And I like how he goes from this dramatic fight to right back to business. Okay, 8 beavers. Okay. So a couple days later, the 17th of October, we start late, having had rain and snow all night, which prevented us from starting until 10 a.m. The road, by following the banks of the river, was very rocky, stony, and hilly, and the river had taken an eastern course. And again, this is Immigrant Creek still. We left in hopes of not only shortening our distance, but also finding a better road. But in the latter, we were sorely disappointed. For from the time of our starting until sunset, we had one continued gully of rocks and stone. It was a hard day labor for our poor horses. Here we are now, with the exception of 7 men who I sent off this morning to examine a large fort, all assembled together. So Ogden was in camp some miles north of the present site of Burns, having reached the junction of Emigrant Creek and the Sillies River. The wounded men I found are doing well, but Baptiste is very low and greatly changed. From our camp this morning, 6 beaver, and from the party, there are 134 beaver and 1 otter. One of the, it just said F, I don't know if Freeman or French, maybe women of the camp missing with 3 horses. I apprehend she has either lost or has fallen sacrifice to the snakes, to the Paiutes. So, again, the women don't usually get mentioned until something that makes him nervous enough where he decides to slip up and mention it. So on the 80th, the next day, remained in camp and sent off a party of men with Mr. McKay in quest of the woman and 3 horses missing. Our wounded men had a most restless night, and both are but poorly this day. Half the traps were not visited this day in consequence of the men gone in search of the woman missing. The nights are now very cold, again October, with an inch of ice, an inch of thickness. Some of our trappers who have been about 10 miles down the stream inform me the river divides into a number of small channels which soon become lost in swamps. I did not expect the river would have terminated in this way. I was all along the opinion it would have discharged into the Snake River through the Owyhee. There still is some beaver remaining in it, and while we are detained here with our wounded men, shall examine and visit the country around us. At present, so far as the eye can see, it is a fine level plain. And the mountains on both sides of the plain appear far distant. Our course yesterday, distance 16 miles. Beavers this day 6. From this we may conclude there are but a few remaining. One of the trappers prevailed on 2 Indians to accompany him to camp, to the Paiutes. On arrival, they appeared greatly alarmed. It was sometimes ere they became reconciled, having given them something to eat and conversed with them. We prevailed on them to give us some idea of the country around us, which they did. Okay, which was representing rivers to the eastward of us abound in beaver, but in the direction we are going, and from where it appears their camp is, they informed us there was a river but no beaver. However, it appeared evident to me they did not wish us to go in that direction, and rather appearing to advise us to go in a different quarter. You know, they're not dumb. Their language is nearly the same as the lower stakes, who are the Bannock, which is, it's true, the Paiute language and the Bannock language is very close, and they're close to related. I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end. The words, however, some things differently. In the evening, Mr. McKay and the party returned. They found the woman with her 3 horses. She had not lost the track, but finding herself benighted in the nighttime, very prudently encamped, and this morning, having considerable difficulty in finding her horses, was the cause of her delay. All so far well, as I was really apprehensive some serious accident had happened to her and her horses. There were many Indians, the Paiutes, roving about, and it's almost a miracle she escaped. There is always more danger to be apprehended in the rear of a camp than in advance, for it is generally at the trail of it that leads to the discovery of a party. So, a couple things jump out at me there. One is, apparently, they were pretty comfortable with everybody spreading out, right? They weren't all bunched together in total fear all the time, that this woman was on her own until she didn't show up in the evening in the camp. You know, that caused alarm. But before that, these were pretty independent people traveling in October in the inch ice with their own horses, doing their own thing, and then re-rendezvousing together. Pretty amazing and tough people. And then I guess again it was just that first altercation. If the Iroquois gentleman and his partner hadn't been so convinced they had to teach a lesson and maybe do something that Ogden, if he would have been there, would have been more, taking some goods and tongue lashed them in some other way, they might have not got injured. One of them I think had 2 arrows embedded, and the other 3. They did both those folks survived and went on to camp later, but they had a pretty rough time with it. And as Ogden was saying, it probably didn't help their relations in any way with the Indian folks. Okay, the 28th of October. So 3 Paiute Indians made a bold attempt in the night, and they certainly could not have had a more favorable night. It was very dark and rainy, but on the alarm being given, and the confusion that ensued, the thieves made their escape. And this morning we followed their tracks some distance, and I'm of the opinion that they are now off. They have taken off. And this afternoon, Mr. McKay and a party arrived and report as follows. It's probable that McKay, so this is a note from the people that transcribed these original notes. Probable that McKay with his party had crossed what is now known as Sage Hand Hill between Silver Lake and Wright Point and reached Harney Lake, which they call the Salt Lake, near midpoint. Their snake guides conducted them to a country of rivers and lakes. One of the latter, the water is salt, Harney Lake. And its length they did not ascertain. So far, they have abandoned a swampy country in the waters of this river, as well as the other streams, as well as both ends of the lake, all discharge into it. This lake must certainly be very low and also very deep, and that halfway, to receive no less than 3 different streams without one discharging from it. It is certainly rather strangely constructed, and all these different streams are well lined with willows and sufficient water, still no beaver. Their success amounts to only 15. Their traps they left from where the party returned, and as far as they could see the country level, and from the following reports we may prepare to starve. As the country is not only destitute of beaver, which they were also eating the beaver, that was one of their main food sources when they could get enough, but also animals of every description. Of wild fowl, however, the country appears well stored, but we cannot depend on them for food for more than 1 day. So clearly, feeding themselves was a significant issue. The beaver were not just for the pellets, was the main driver, but also for the food they get from it. And then they were also trying to do hunting, and they just weren't finding a lot of game down in the marshy area down in here, but lots of birds. So that sounds a little familiar. Okay, 31st of October, excuse me. It was late ere we started, about midday. We had wind and, okay, never mind, I'm doing as bad as I thought. We had wind and rain and advised us to advance at a quicker pace than usual, and at sunset we reached the lakes. A small ridge of land about an acre in width divides the fresh water from the salt water, so Harney and Malheur lakes. And they have no intercourse with each other. In the first lake, Malheur, the water has a rather unpleasant taste. About a mile in width and 9 miles in length, this lake discharges Sylvia's River, so Sylvia's River flows into it, and also 2 other small forks, but has no discharge. Harney Lake at the south end of it, 3 miles in width, its length at present unknown to us, but appears a large body of water of saltish taste. All hands gave it a trial, but none could drink it. Kind of wonder how everyone kept trying it. Anyway, it appears to take a west course. All the country around us is low and destitute of wood, with the exception of wormwood, which is their name for sagebrush, and brush, which I guess rabbit brush probably. And we had difficult finding even sufficiency to cook our supper. Our traps in the camp, so everyone's together in the camp, they all the traps in. Provisions scarce and prospects gloomy. Some years since, buffalo visited this quarter, as a number of heads and carcasses are still to be seen along the borders of the lake at present. However, none to be seen, nor animals of any kind. Fowl in abundance, but very shy. 1 beaver from nearly 50 traps. So this is one thing you'll see in other publications occasionally, because it is noting that the bison were here. And the bison were already wiped out by that point, or not coming back, but there were so many, there were notable carcasses and skulls lining the river that they saw, that they took exception to. And in the 1920s or 30s, a doctor down here who was working with the Paiute Indians and took some notes about them, asked some of the elders about that. And they said that, at some point, the bison used to come every year, an annual rotation. We would hunt them around the lakes. But then one year they came and the fur was falling off their skins, and they were starving and looking very sickly. And then they never came back again. And then they actually wrote a song, which in songs in most Indian culture are not like pop ditties on the radio like we have now, but they were often kind of prayers. This was a prayer to call back the buffalo, to ask the buffalo to come back. Sadly, it didn't work, but anyway, a lot of bits of evidence that there were actually woodland bison in this country and were actually a major food source for the Indians up until this die-off. And illness kind of makes sense. There's a lot of debate. A lot of wild animal numbers, deer and elk, I'm going to cover those at the end of this, were a lot less than they are now, which seems counterintuitive to us. But there were very few seen. And that could just be because the Indians were hunting them all the time, and there were grizzly bear that were hunting them, and wolf packs back in the day, so maybe there were just fewer in general. But there is a theory that maybe cattle diseases swept through the wildlife populations the same way human diseases swept through the American Indian people. And so that by the time, the disease fronts went ahead of actual European explorers and stuff, and so the populations were already decimated by that point. And unfortunately, the evidence of if that's really happened, the biological evidence, no one has found it. It wouldn't, it'd be all the bacteria that killed them or whatever, the virus that killed them. There wouldn't be evidence of anything archaeologists would find. So it's an open case. But it's a very interesting observation. So now we're into the 2nd of November. About 4 a.m., the snow began to fall and did not cease until after midday. We could well have dispensed with this, as my 2 expressmen will in consequence have some difficulty in discovering our tracks on their return from Fort Vancouver. So he actually sent a couple volunteers to ride all the way back to Fort Vancouver to deliver a message and how the party was going and whatever other information, and then get whatever mail came from the corporate office back to them. And they had to find where they were coming through. Again, 150 people, a bunch of horses, it would be fairly obvious where the snow is going to cover them up. We take every precaution in making marks at our different encampments to assist them. Should not the Indians destroy them, which I seriously apprehend they will, for I'm confident from the number of tracks we see in all directions. They are soon in our encampments after we leave it. It is almost incredible the number of Indians in this quarter. We cannot go 10 yards in any direction without finding their huts, generally made of sagebrush or grass, and probably tule and bulrush. And of the size to contain from 6 to 8 persons. I'm fully of the opinion there is no Indian nation so numerous as they are in all of North America. So this was, the northern Paiute wintering grounds here around the lakes he's talking about. And from what I've seen and other people know, Ogden doesn't exaggerate a lot. He was truly impressed on the number of people that were here. Now, he wasn't seeing the people very often because, they weren't sure what that interaction would be like, so they scurried off and abandoned their camps ahead of them. This is in all this bulrush and sagebrush, so they could go a little bit, hunker down, and then come back to their camp after these guys passed by. So an old Paiute woman who encamped with us some night since, who stumbled into their camp and stayed with them, and it was very communicative, and the information she gave us of the country around us I've discovered to be the most correct. So she was a good guide. Also informed us from the severity of the weather last winter, they were so extremely reduced for want of food. 2 of her own children who had died through weakness, and miserable and unfortunate creatures to what suffering and cruel privations are you not doomed to endure, but the Almighty has so ordained it. What an example is this for us. When we are at present, when he and his trappers are at present, for instance, without beaver and reduced to 1 meal a day, how loudly and grievously do we complain? But in truth, how unjustly and without cause, when I consider the snake's suffering, the Paiute suffering, compared to our own. Ours many a day do they pass without food and still without a complaint or murmur, and in this wretched manner do they pass their lives. Had they arms and ammunition, they might resort to the buffalo. So go to the Great Plains, the other side of the Rockies, but to get buffalo. But without having arms and ammunition, the war tribes of the Lakota and the tribes of the plains would soon wipe them out. Their country is now nearly destitute of beaver to enable them to procure arms, and Indian traders in the present times cannot well afford to supply them for free. Before this happens, a wonderful change must happen. So I find this very interesting. So on one level, Ogden obviously has a lot of empathy for what the Paiute are going through here. And probably very little understanding of what their lifestyle was actually like. He's really thinking the best thing they could do is go all the way to get horses, guns, go all the way to the plains, fight with the Sioux, and then drag the meat back. The Bannock Indians, they're close relatives just to the east, so the Shoshone were doing that. But, they were a little closer. He didn't understand gathering and processing rabbits and the fish and all the other things the Paiutes were doing here. And I'm not saying that there wasn't some starvation as this woman described to them. That may have happened the year before. I don't know for sure, but I don't think that was their annual lifestyle by any means. But I don't blame him for noticing that, and I do think it's compelling that he feels that their party is being big whiners because they only eat once a day compared to what this woman is describing and what the Paiute people are going through. Now, it's true he had an American Indian wife, so he had some empathy for, I think, American Indian folks. But he also was the person wiping out the beaver, which was what he thought if they had the beaver, then they could trade. And, so anyway, it's a mixed bag. And a pretty amazing observation. So, then some months happened, and they went out to the Crooked River, and they went down part of the Deschutes, up the part of the Deschutes, crossed into Klamath country, did Klamath Lakes, got into the Umpqua, I think, did quite a trip, and then came back and kind of crossed through, if I remember right, kind of Lakeview country. They were at Goose Lake, and then took a shortcut, trying to get back up to here, which they regretted, but then by June, so we're back in the summer now. So we all know the difference between water levels at late fall, right, and water levels at early summer. But so late June, they're coming up from the south, and then here. Okay, I didn't have that. So they came up along Steens Mountain, basically, or Alvord Desert. I think they were on that side, and then passed back onto Silver Lake or Silver Creek. So it's June 7, 6 a.m. we started. We had not proceeded far when we found ourselves surrounded on all sides by water. And from appearances, a considerable distance in advance, the country is overflowed. There were retracing. There was no retracting. Go on, we must. It doesn't have punctuation. It's a little hard to read. Go on, we must. And for 3 miles, we had on average 3 feet of water to wade through. On those, had as many more in mud and mire. When we reached the small river, Silver Creek, seen last fall, to ford it, we were obliged to unload all the horses and carry the packs across, not from the depth of the water, but the horses could not, with their loads, extract themselves out of the mud and mire as they crossed Silver Lake. So, whatever, 100 horses, all that all had to be unloaded and packed across. And although taking every precaution, they didn't have Gore-Tex, they didn't wrap these things in something waterproof, still 6 packs were wet on reaching the opposite side. We encamped, distance 12 miles, course northeast. So, we think there's a little flooding out there right now. This sounds like it was a bit more. Obviously, a lot of drainage systems and ditches have gone into our current situation. Hunters were in quest of game, but without success. So, Wednesday, June 27th. Only 1 beaver from our traps at 8 a.m. At 8 a.m. we started following down the stream, and in our progress crossed over 2 fine streams, all wooded and water deep. At 12 we rejoined all the trappers with the exception of 6 who are still in advance, and they have taken 81 beaver and 4 otters. All this helps, and although we have both sultry weather, and has been so far some time past, the fur is still good, far superior to some beaver taken in the winter season. This is certainly strange, and to me I cannot assign any reason for it being so, excepting the rainy climes are not overly favorable for beaver. So they were traveling in the winter because the beaver fur was so thicker, and the amount of the fur they could produce for pellets was so much greater, it made sense to travel in that miserable weather. And here he's shacked in June, he's finding beaver of almost the same quality on the Sylvia's River, a little bit north of the city, is where they are right now. We had a fine road, level and not stony, 10 miles course south and east. On 28th June, having a number of green skins, so unprocessed beaver skins, and some of the trappers being far in the rear, so the main camp's ahead of the trappers. Beaver are not overabundant, and I'm anxious to obtain all I can ere I return back to Fort Vancouver. And even with the number we shall have from the length of time we have been about will be miserable returns. The trappers not averaging more than 100 beavers each. So the trappers were actually kind of basically being paid in the beavers that they got. And sometimes there was trading going on between, they might have supplies that our trapper didn't have. Anyway, he figured on average about 100 beaver skins each. This alone is to be attributed to the poverty of the country we have this year discovered, and not to want of exhortation. For with few exceptions, all have done their duty. So he's praising his trappers. Nice of a leader. A party of 6 trappers started in advance with their traps, and those in the rear came in with 22 beavers. Thursday, July 5th. This morning we reached camp, following it down the stream until we reached the entrance of a fork. So this is the main stem of the mall here with the South Fork near Riverside. Yeah, excuse me, they started in the Sylvies, but then by the last thing I read, they had actually been going overland, trying to avoid all the water, and heading to the mall here. So they're South Fork near Riverside, where our traps are and in camps. Our trappers are in camp. This is 6 miles over one continued hill, rocky and stones in this short distance. As far as we can see in advance, the country appears very rocky and hilly, and from the number of rapids in the river, beaver could not be very numerous. One of our trappers discovered an Indian who was concealed near his traps with no other intention but stealing, so as to give him a fright. He discharged his gun at him, the ball passing sufficiently in the air to give him the desired effect, for he soon disappeared. We have this day 12 beavers, of course, these very sultry weather. So again, his relationship with the tribal folks is mixed. He didn't mind, he's just assuming this guy was trying to steal something. Well, maybe, but. Saturday, July 7th in the afternoon, my trappers arrived, rather disappointed at finding the party of 7 men who'd started, and the third had trapped the upper part of the fork. So they were double trapping streams. We have still 5 traps at some distance up the fork, which will retain us until late tomorrow, where we can start the remainder of our traps are set in the vicinity of camp. With no great hopes of success today, we have 12 beaver. In the evening, two Paiute Indians arrived and remained all night. These Indians we saw last fall were useful to us in giving us information of the country. We treated them kindly, and in return they directed us to follow downstream, down the mall here, to a large fork on the left-hand side of the river, which we us following ascend until we reach a small fork that discharged into it. By sending it to its source, we will then have a point of land to cross to reach the Snake River. They informed us, do not attempt descending the main stream as it cuts rocks and horses would find it impossible to pass. This advice we shall follow, as I suppose Papayo will descend it. So, again, now he met a couple of Indian folks he met earlier in the trip. They all got along. Monday, July 9th, 5 a.m. We started at 11. We reached the fork. The fore part of our day's journey was hilly and stony. The latter part level and well covered with sagebrush. We passed an old camp of snakes. So this is getting down close to the Snake River, in probably the Vale area. We passed an old camp of snakes, Paiute Indians, upward of 50 huts. So that was a winter camp, but this is the summer, and people left their winter camp. They appear to have remained here the greater part of the winter, for I observed for 2 miles beyond the camp, they had peeled the bark of the sagebrush. It is with this they manufacture their scoop nets for salmon fishing, and lines and ropes for their horses. And it answers well, almost equal to that manufactured with him. So almost as good as the rope that the Europeans had. I advanced 2 miles on the fork and in camp. Paiute with 7 men, with 7 men had continued down the main stem, and it appears 3 men had ascended this fork. Traps in the water. This day 6 beaver. Our party in advance had not left many for us, nor do I suppose they have taken many, for since yesterday the river is one continued rapid. Our course today east distance 16 miles. One of the trappers, on examining a small fork, discovered an Indian with his wife, but before he could come near them, they disappeared, abandoning their hut. In it he found a number of buffalo robes, also dressed skin. He took one of each, leaving his knife in lieu of this. On their return, they will be convincing proof of our honest and friendly intentions. Yeah, okay. Towards them, more than they deserve. Were they to come within reach of our property and horses, I'm confident they would leave nothing in lieu. They trust too much to our kindness towards them. I think he was grumpy that day. Whoops, wrong buttons. Okay, so that was that expedition. Right? Ask quick if there's questions now, or move on to a few more notes. We'll move on. Excellent. This is a map of his 28-29 expedition. So he got back up to Fort Dennis Pearson, and he as the leader had to go to Fort Vancouver, where the big boss for the area was, meet up and report. He had 2 months off, and then he's doing another 10-month expedition. So, 28-29. So this one, they came down the Snake to the mall here, followed the mall here, river down, dropped down, went along Steens Mountain, and then dropped. This is actually the expedition where he went all the way to Salt Lake. So he went to the Humboldt River and out to Salt Lake. So Ogden, Utah is obviously named after him. And then they came back, copied their route back up Steens Mountain, the side of Steens Mountain. They actually crossed over part of Steens Mountain. They got up high for a view, and then came down along Lahir Lake and went back up Sylvie's river, crossed over the Crooked River, I think. No, I take that back, he went up onto the John Day from there. So, now we're back in October, so they start in the fall again. 7 a.m. and at 10 a.m., we'll say 9 a.m., reached the river Malheur at Ventura, Oregon. And a most hilly and stony road this day, upwards of 150 traps in the water, only one beaver and one trap lost. The trappers report there are beaver, but are very wild. The traps are not raised. On the 15th, the next day, third watch, in the night watch, watching over the horses in the camp, gave the call that there was an Indian amongst the horses. This proved to be true, for he had taken one, was already mounted, and although a shot was fired at him, he effected his escape with the horse. This was certainly a most daring exploit, and attended with success. Fortunately, the horse he had taken was reduced to skin and bones, and for some days past had performed the day's journey with difficulty. The trappers raised their traps, and only 4 beaver and 4 traps stolen. The cursed snakes, not one we can obtain sight of. So he was wanting to see them to get information on the country and maybe trade with them. I'm not sure why he's cursing them, but okay. Ascended the river 12 miles over a hilly and most stony country, all our traps in camp, starvation making its appearance. I wish it was otherwise. So that was kind of fast on this trip. Whoops, I went backwards. Can't tell if this is the one I already read. Yes, this is one I've already read. What am I doing wrong? There we go. Now I'm going in the right direction. So, October 25th, 1828, the night our Indian made an escape. So an Indian came in and agreed to hang out with them, and they were hoping he would be a guide, but he left in the night. So we shall not have his assistance, but grope along as well as we can and never despair. Always the optimist. At 8 a.m. we started, shortly passed over a small lake, Man Lake. Here the Indian track was scarcely visible. I gave orders to Brevet to proceed on, and with 2 men I ascended the high mountain streams. As far as we could see, the country appears covered with lakes, but no river. Late in the evening, I reached the camp and encamped on the borders of a small lake, Little Alvord Lake, and covered with ducks and geese, which afforded us a supper, which many stood greatly in need of. Oh yeah, so the indentured servant company men, so-called company men and their families got to eat of the main supplies. The free men had to bring their own food supplies. And every once in a while, you know, Ogden would try to share with them to get them by. But basically, yeah, they got hungry first, I'll put it that way. So they were very happy with cooked birds. Okay. Monday the 27th, at daylight I sent off 2 men in advance to discover the country in advance and to return this way with the camp. I started at 7 a.m. following the banks of Harney Lake, about 9 miles in length, 4 in width, as usual without a discharge. We passed a hot spring. The expedition camped at the site of present-day fields, more or less. The water in nearly a boiling state with a strong smell of sulfur. Tracks and huts of Indians most numerous, but all have taken flight, so I have no hopes of seeing them. And that was fall, so they probably were in their winter camp already, so they probably did just flee ahead of them. Late last night, the 2 men I sent in advance arrived, so the next day, and reported they had seen a camp of Indians, about 40 there, and conversed with them. And all the information they could obtain with the course we were now going, we would find a river well stocked with beaver. And they promised to await our arrival, but this I doubt. 7 a.m. they started and traveled over a level country and passed over a lake. The expedition passed over Tum Tum Lake. So the river the Indians were referring to was the Humboldt River system. A few days as these guys traveled, which is kind of hard for me to picture, south of us in Nevada. And so they headed that way. And I'm not going to follow them, but then as they came back from that country, after going all the way to Salt Lake, so now we're in June again, although to the contrary of the wishes of 1/4 of the party, who preferred to go directly to Fort Nez Perce, stating as their reason scarcity of provisions, And all the route I now take will lengthen our journey by at least 15 days. I am hopeful we'll add 200 beaver to our stock. So, not always the most popular leader, in spite of a lot of people wanting just to go back home. He wanted to take a longer route and try to get more beaver. At sunrise, we started, wishing to avoid the heat of the day, which now became almost insupportable. On starting, we ascended some very high hills, and fortunately for our horses' feet, well covered in small stones. We shortly after found a small brook, in a hilly country, and at 2 p.m. reached a fork of Unfortunate River, the Malheur River. And the same, in my opinion, we were camped on last fall when I started on my voyage of discovery. So last fall when they left to go to Humboldt. Here we encamped. The suffrage of our dogs was truly great. Which I didn't even know they had dogs, but apparently they did, and they're suffering. The heat of the day equally so. Course northwest, distance 15 miles, 12 traps in the water. Whoops. Too far. Thursday the 6th. Oh no, that was the one. Okay. The dawn. So on the 21st of June, at dawn of the day, the trappers started with their traps. At sunrise, I followed with the camp and commenced ascending the river. Advanced 10 miles in the camp. Within a mile of the place, my 2 men were wounded in 1827. So they're on the Sylvies at the fork with Emigrant Creek, I believe, or near there. There does not appear to be any natives on the river this season. The trappers arrived and do not appear very sanguine. Whatever, queen. If we can take sufficient to feed us, it will be a great point gained by coming this way. For I am well aware, had we gone by Unfortunate River, a number of our horses would have been killed for food. Heat this day very great. As all our traps are in the water, the next day, as all our traps are in the water and our horses recover repose, we did not raise camp. Our success amounts to 18 beaver. Rather surviving at this late season, the fur is still good, the meat also. Our hunters were so far fortunate to kill 4 antelope and wounded a grizzly bear. And I'm not sure where you're fortunate in wounding a grizzly bear, but maybe. So anyway, that was the last of the notes, and there's a lot more, but I tried to hit some of the highlights. Basically, every day you get how far and what direction they went, how many beaver they caught, what game they managed to procure to eat, and how they were doing in general that way. But I'm going to go through a couple tables. So I compiled all the information here, added everything up, and the first table is looking at the number of beaver taken by drainage and the dates they were working on. So, and it's by, it starts with the Crooked River, South Fork of the John Day, main stem of the John Day. So it covers more country than I've talked about here, but it gives an idea of how many saw. And one of the neat things that really jumps out is just how productive the Sylvian River system was. So in 3 different periods of time passing through here with dwindling numbers. So in October of 1826, 3 weeks in the Sylvian system, they trapped 425 beaver. In June of 27, about the same time period, they trapped 133 beaver. And then 2 years later, June of 1829, they got 37. And I don't have it, but in the notes they're complaining about, the Indians are setting fires to the beaver lodges and killing off the beaver. And wait, didn't he read his own note that said they were supposed to overtrap intentionally all the beaver and wipe them out as they went? Maybe the fact that they had trapped it 2 years ago aggressively heavily was why they weren't beaver. Maybe the other thing too. But anyway, that's more than the John Day system produced. That's more beaver than were on the Crooked River. The Malheur River was a pretty good producer in 28 too, with 327 total. But anyway, it was good, basically good country for them compared to other places they went. If all the river systems were producing that well, more of their group would have got wealthy. So then large game animals, and this one really surprised me. Again, 5 professional hunters hired to be able to feed the group, and they're just not coming across that much game. And these are old musket type guns, or maybe early versions of rifle, but still pretty basic guns. But professional hunters back then were pretty good at what they did, and I find it surprising. So This is combined, the Crooked River, the Great Basin, John Day, Sylvies, Burnt River. So in all those drainages over these multiple years of these expeditions, so many months out in the country, 63 deer, 7 elk, 27 pronghorn, 6 mountain sheep. Not really large numbers. And usually there were vast swaths of land that they weren't able to see any animals at all. I believe fewer, more than, we have managed herds now, so it's a little bit different thing. We don't have grizzly bears, and you have to get a license and hunt at certain times of year and all that, while we have the higher numbers. But I was surprised, I think they were surprised. They were hoping to have more game. So they ate a lot of the beaver, which were edible but not preferable. So it just paints a different picture than in my head. I would have thought there would have been more game animals at the time. And then since I am former Forest Service, and we were looking a lot at the history of wildfire and how much are things out of whack from what they used to be, and how should we be treating the landscape to try to get fire to not be as devastating as a lot of these in the last couple of decades these wildfires have been. So there are several mentions of wildfire or Indians using fire in this thing, in the records here. So back on the Snake River, the opposite side of the river, they saw a wildfire start, or maybe Indian caused fire. Soon 2 Indians came down, so they attributed it to the Indians. And then on the Deschutes, a large part of the route, several days, they were going through an area lately overrun by fire with smoke so dense the party became disoriented. And they were hearing trees crashing, in the background. So, that's a heavier fire than we usually picture the natural wildfire regime of Ponderosa Pine at the time. And then, country overrun by fire, that's the same, different note of the same thing. On the Crooked River, they were camped near the river, and some Indians set fire to the grass all around. And Ogden interpreted this as a deliberate camp, or a different attempt to burn over his camp and drive them away, which is possible. The Indian folks weren't necessarily thrilled they were there, but it might have been what they were doing on an annual basis to maintain the grass burning in the fall when they were heading to their winter camping grounds. And then on the Sylvius River, and this was down, just to the north, I would say, or actually, I think down in the valley here. About 4 hours after it took place, fires were lighted, after they took to the area, fires were lighted in all directions by the Indians. And he interpreted this as a signal for the Indians to collect, to meet together. Again, maybe, but it might also just be that they were burning it off. So that was also in the fall. So they should have been moving down to this area. Yeah, not sure. Anyway, I won't go on and on, but you get the idea. The Indians were using fire back in that day, and this has some of the first evidence of that. And then I'm going to quickly go over how this reflects the Great Basin Indian tribes. And what I find really fascinating is what Ogden described, if you read notes in enough detail, is exactly what anthropologists now describe. He called them something different. He said there were 3 types of snake Indians. So Indians in the broader snake country. The plains snake, the lower snake, and the upper snake. So the plains snakes lived furthest to the east and adopted the Great Plains Indian lifestyle that included dependence on the horse, bison hunting, and ritual warfare. The plains snakes, this is a quote, headed by 6 chiefs, are about 2,000 in number. In their conduct towards us, they have so far comported themselves with propriety. They reside entirely in the buffalo country, so on the east side of the Rocky Mountains, or the plains. These were most certainly eastern and northern Shoshone tribes. The lower snake will also use the horse, but we're less reliant on hunting bison. Ogden states that the lower snake were known as the Bannocks. They actually use the term that anthropologists use, the Bannock. The same term used in the modern era. So the quote from Ogden was known by the name of Bannocks, and in the spring descended the south branch, the Snake River, and they support themselves on roots and salmon. The Bannocks were northern Paiute speakers who apparently migrated from eastern Oregon into Idaho and joined up with the Shoshone. And so they traveled with the Shoshone often and intermarried with them to a certain extent, but basically kept separate camps. I mean, the villages would be together, but that's the Shoshone and that's the Bannocks. And so probably they were figuring out that, it would be smart to pick up on this whole Indians and guns business, because that seems to be the most powerful people. They were getting raided by different plains groups, and so they joined that lifestyle, and and were known by Ogden as the lower stakes. Ogden noted that both the plains and lower stakes live in a constant state of dread and apprehension of being attacked by the Saskatchewan, the Great Plains Indian tribes, and many are killed by them. So just real quickly, from the late 1700s in the Great Lakes region, as Europeans expanded westward, they were pushing different Indian tribes also westward. So the Sioux, who we think of often in the Lakota as Great Plains tribes, actually originated in Wisconsin and Minnesota, in that country, but were forced westward. And in that process, these different groups picked up a real warfare-based lifestyle to survive. And they were fighting with each other because the groups they were being pushed into didn't necessarily like that happening, as well as trying to push back on the Europeans encroaching from the east. So by the time you get all the way over here, there had been a century of that process. And folks were picking up that Plains Indian lifestyle of riding horses, counting coup, something that probably wouldn't have existed if there wasn't that push from the Europeans coming over. It was a relatively recent, few hundred year lifestyle. Anyway, that was showing up as far west as this area. Getting close, guys. Still too far. Ogden called the third group the Upper Snakes. He noted, so upstream on the Snake River. He noted they spoke a language very similar to the Lower Snakes. One of the trappers prevailed on 2 Indians to accompany him to the camp. On arrival, they appeared greatly alarmed, and it was some time ere they became reconciled. Their language is nearly the same as the Lower Snakes. They would, however, word things differently. This observation was made in October 1826 near Malheur and Harney Lakes. I actually quoted it to you a little earlier. They had extensive winter villages around the lakes. Okay, I quoted that part earlier too. So anyway, this is the northern Paiute. And the journals strongly indicate in the 1820s, the northern Paiute were the dominant Indian tribe, not just down here along the lakes, which there isn't much contention about, but into the southern Columbia Plateau, including the upper reaches of the Deschutes and the John Day River systems, as well as the entire Malheur River. Some 46 journal entries from those river systems mention encounters with American Indians or observed their encampments. Of these, 18 entries simply refer to the people as Indians. 25 refer to Snake Indians, and they would be these upper snakes, and only 7 refer to the Fort Nez Perce. Those would be the Sahaptin-speaking Columbia River Indians who are the immediate ancestors of the Warm Springs, Umatilla, Cayuse, and Nez Perce, maybe even Yakima crossing from Washington down. So relatively few of the Columbia River Indians, even quite far into what's often ascribed to be Columbia River Indian territory. When the actual numbers of individuals are provided, 12 were described as Indians, 77 Snake, and there were no Fort Nez Perce Indians only seen, only camps that Ogden thought were Fort Nez Perce. Indian camps or huts are reported in 14 entries. 2 of these were not named. One was thought to be Cayuse, and 11 Snakes. So there's a lot of debate in anthropology about where the boundary between the northern Paiute and the Columbia River tribes are. And in truth, there's no really clean boundary like European descendant people like to make. The Indian tribes have a great overlap in the areas where they where they lived. And that's probably what a lot of this is reflecting. But, so they, probably both groups used a lot of that John Day River country and all that. And that's the confusion. But as far as who they saw actually there camping and doing stuff when they went through, it was Paiutes, which the people I know among the Burns Paiute have been telling me that for years, and Ogden seems to back them up. The largest Indian cabin on the John Day River was a Paiute salmon fishing village near the present town of Kimberly that was visited by Ogden in 1829 and worked 2 years later in 1831. Ogden reported that he reached the snake camp of 50 men with their families, all busily employed with their salmon fisheries. We had not long arrived before upward of 200 half-dried salmon were traded. But at an extravagant rate, these Indians having almost daily intercourse with the Fort Nez Perce tribes, so the Columbia River tribes, beg full value for all they have. Imagine that, they wanted what they were worth. I have obtained 3 beavers from them. They still have 10 which they will not part with without a horse in return. They are in expectation of soon seeing the Cayuse chief here to trade. So Cayuse and down. So even though there was warfare between the Columbia River tribes and the Northern Paiute at times, then they turned around and they actually met and traded too, which is pretty common of, frankly, human beings all over the world. We don't want to make assumptions on that. And that is actually what I have to present today. So at this point, any questions or? Okay. Well, thank you for coming down. If you're curious at all, and I'll give it to Jim, I do have the Historical Society published books of these. If you want to get a feeling for what they're like, they're kind of neat. There's big maps on the back and all that. But you're welcome to look at them. But be careful of them because I borrowed them for the Forest Service and they'll yell at me if I don't get them back when I shake them.
Thank you, Don. I want to talk about a couple more events we have coming up. Next Saturday at the Chamber of Commerce down here, we're having Edward Hines Day, reminiscing with Edward Hines, and hopefully some of the workers show up. Or, young people show up to see because they don't understand what the mill was for the town of Burns River. So that's next Saturday. And then the 19th of May, right here on Friday night, we have Paul Cronin going to talk about the Meeks Trail. And then the 23rd, that's a Tuesday at the library, Scott Thomas will be talking about edible plants. And then our big thing, the 24th of June, it's a Saturday, Archaeology Roadshow. And if you haven't been one of those, you'll want to be at those. And those are, we have experts, Donnelly here, my daughter. We'll have experts if you bring your stuff in. Like you have a nail, you have some cans, you have some artifacts, they'll kind of tell you what they think they are. And then that evening we have June. Somebody say something? Anyway, that's the coming events we'll have. I'll have it on the radio and the paper. And remember, the museum is open Tuesday through Saturdays, 10 to 4. So you need to come up there, and we're always looking for volunteers. So if you feel like you need to volunteer at the museum, we'd love to have you. Thanks for coming.